You had to go all the way.
One place.
Yeah.
So.
I think we should.
We want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Peach Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, the Tataviam, Katanamuk, Serrano, Cahuilla, Peon-Cowichim, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed and contextual land acknowledgement authored by the USC Van Hunnock History Department, we invite you to visit their website, and I'll put a link in the chat shortly for those of you on Zoom. So thank you all for being here for our first event of the spring semester. And thank you to those of you here in person and those of you joining on Zoom. My name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you. So a couple of notes about the Zoom protocols. Right now, you should be viewing a side-by-side view of the slides that are being shared and the speaker, and you can make either window bigger or larger by dragging the dividing line in the middle. So if you want to make Alexia even more prominent than she already is, you can do that. And we'll have time for questions and discussion following the lecture. We invite, of course, questions from those of you in the room, and also on Zoom using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we'll get to as many questions as we can as time allows. And we're going to share the chat and all the questions, regardless of if they're asked or not, with Alexia following the lecture. So if you have comments or questions that we don't get to, she will see them. And we ask that you keep your engagement respectful to each other online and towards the speaker. And that goes for everyone in the room as well. And also for those of you in the room, please help yourself to more sandwiches and sides if there are any. There are some to-go boxes back there. So when the lecture concludes, you're welcome to take some sandwiches to go if you'd like. We're always happy to feed our audiences to come in person. So now to introduce today's lecture and today's speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Brunner.
Thank you very much, Martha. Thank you for all the preparatory work for our first meeting, which is hybrid in person and on Zoom. For those who don't know the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, it was founded in 2014, and what we try to do is to advance new areas of interdisciplinary research regarding genocide and mass violence. We try to promote the unique resources we have here at USC regarding Holocaust and genocide studies. For example, the Visual History Archive, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Collection, and also archival collections at the special collections at Doheny. By inviting scholars to do research at the center, we are trying to transform the ways how we understand the origins, dynamics, and also consequences of mass violence. And we are focusing especially also on aspects of resistance here, the conditions and dimensions of resistance. We have a lively, rich academic program, which consists of annual conferences. Last year, we hosted two enormous conferences, one on genocide studies and one on Holocaust studies, each with 200 scholars from over 46 countries here. So part of our work is the lecture series, which we are very happy that we actually can almost entirely staffed the series with our fellows. And one of the fellows today is Alexia. And she holds the Beth and Arthur Lev Student Research Fellowship of 2024. This fellowship was first bestowed in 2018 and enables specifically, and this is rare because most of our fellowships are actually geared to an international audience. This one is specific for USC students. And it enables graduate students and undergraduate students to work with the unique resources I already mentioned in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies here at USC. We offer our thanks to Beth and Arthur Lev, whose generosity has supported until now 6 undergraduate student scholars and 7 PhD candidate scholars since the inception of this fellowship. So I'm saying this to the students on Zoom, but also in the room. If you are inspired by this, please apply it for the fellowship when you have a research project. The fellowship kind of application time is right now. The door is open for you to apply. Okay, so now to the fellowship recipient of last year, which is Alexia Orengo-Green. She is a PhD candidate at the history department at USC. She earned her bachelor's at Dickinson College, where she majored in 2 fields, history and archaeology. And then later she moved on to New York University, where she earned a master's in archives and public history. For her dissertation project on the experience of Jewish refugee children in Latin America, Alexia has already received international recognition. She received several international fellowships, among them the highly competitive Junior Research Fellowship at the Center for Holocaust Studies in Munich, Germany. And just yesterday, she told me that she also received for next year the Dr. Gabriele Meyer Fellowship at the Institute for the History of German Jews in Hamburg, Germany. Not only fellowships, her work is also increasingly recognized by the invitation to participate in prestigious international summer schools, like the School for European Jewish History at the University of Sussex in England, and the summer school for the Holocaust and Jewish Civilization by the Holocaust Educational Foundation at Northwestern in the United States, both were last year. She is now actually participating in a few days at the West Coast German Studies workshop, where she presents her work, and she is already invited for the Lessons and Legacies Emerging Scholar Conference upcoming this year. She has also finished a draft of an article about the German Jews in Puerto Rico, which she is about to submit to a kind of a peer-reviewed journal. And this is really important because there is no work on this topic done up to now, and so she will be the first writing on this topic. I want to include here, I don't want to go too long, but she has already quite a record as a PhD candidate. But I want to mention that she earned high praise for her teaching at USC. She was a kind of a well-loved TA, and especially for her compassion and inclusion of kind of marginalized students. She was nominated by the History Department twice for the Side Teaching Award, Assistant Award, and she won it in 2024. And this yielded also a nomination for the University TA Award. So I think now, without further ado, I want to give her the floor. So give her a warm hand, Alexia.
Well, thank you so much for that incredible introduction. And before I begin, I want to take a moment to thank both Wolf and Martha for all of their support and encouragement during not only my fellowship, but through the time of me being here in USC as a PhD student. So thank you. I also want to thank the Lev family for their support with this fellowship that gives students like me their opportunities to conduct their research. So thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to begin with my presentation, which is titled, "We Have to Live Germany, Jewish Children's Agency and Acculturation in Latin America During the Holocaust." Okay, there we go. Perfect. In 1939, 9-year-old Eva Bertelmeier, her older sister, and her parents escaped Nazi Germany and went to Paraguay. From Paraguay, the family made their way to Argentina clandestinely one night as they did not have the proper documentation. Eva states that they left as her family had friends in Belgrano, a barrio Buenos Aires, and Eva's health declined because of the weather in Paraguay. She had arrived in Paraguay a little bit sick from Germany. Here is one of the photographs that Eva discusses at the end of her interview. So this is Eva. These are her parents. This is her sister and her sister's husband. The photograph is from November 1940, and it was taken the day of Eva's sister's wedding in Argentina. Rather than speaking on the day of the wedding, she focused on where they were living and her parents' clothing. In her description, translated from Spanish, Eva says, and I quote, "We live in quite a humble house. You can see the wooden kitchen and my mom with her formal dress and my dad with his tuxedo. I mean, it's absurd the primitive traditions that they still follow," end quote. And this back is the wooden structure that she's talking about. That's the kitchen. As you can see, that is wearing a tuxedo and the mom looks amazing dressed, right? Through this picture and Eva's commentary, we can see that compared to her parents, everyone else is dressed less formally than her parents. The juxtaposition of the wooden kitchen, the other attendees of the wedding, and her parents exemplifies the different levels of adaptability within the family. Eva's use of the word primitive to describe her parents dressing formally while in Argentina is one that stands out. As in other child Holocaust refugees interviews, the word primitive is actually used to describe Latin America rather than the other way around. Here, Eva uses primitive to portray her parents as backward for not rapidly adapting to Argentina. This comment hints at the tensions that arose as parents and their children acculturated and adapted to their host countries in Latin America at different speeds. It is moments like this and the experiences that child Holocaust survivors who went to Latin America share on their memoirs, diaries, and oral interviews that my dissertation focuses on, to investigate and highlight the role of children during the mass movement of Jews during the Holocaust. Little bit of historical background. As Nazi persecution heightened, European Jews began to search for countries of refuge that they could flee to. While European Jews had already begun escaping to Latin America since 1933, it was not until 1938 when many began to actually consider the region as an actual place of refuge. By 1938, popular countries of refuge, such as the United States, have made it clear that they were not going to increase their immigration quotas, as seen with the Evian Conference. During the Evian Conference, an international meeting organized by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to discuss the ongoing refugee crisis, the Dominican Republic was the only country to offer to accept Jewish refugees, and they offered to accept exactly 100,000. However, that was not the amount that ended up going to the island. However, it was because Rafael Trujillo wanted to blanket out, whiten the population of the Dominican Republic, while also improving his image. Since in 1937, he had conducted the Parsley Massacre, where approximately 30,000 Haitians died. By the end of the war, Latin America became a place of refuge for approximately 126,000 European Jews who went to final places of refuge like Argentina and Brazil, or transitory locations such as Puerto Rico and Cuba. Due to the nature of my project, my research intersects various historiographical and interdisciplinary discussions from the fields of Holocaust and genocide studies, modern European history, and Latin American history. Within Holocaust studies, scholars such as Deborah DeVork and Jan van Pelt have demonstrated the critical role that government entities had in opening and closing doors to Jewish refugees. Through a narrative that focused on popular locations of refuge, such as the United States, United Kingdom, and British Mandate Palestine. Scholars such as Marian Kaplan in her book Dominican Haven, and Daniela Glaser in El Exilio Incómodo, shifted the historical narrative by highlighting the experiences that Jews had in Latin America and how such countries aim to include or exclude them within the nation. Other scholars, such as Debbie Mays, have explored Jewish migration to Latin America through an extended period of time to demonstrate that migrant Jews continuously use these networks that they created to improve their social standing, their economic standing, and at times also challenge the states which they were in. While the region of Latin America as a place of refuge has gained a greater focus within the overall migration Holocaust narrative, the experiences of Jewish child refugees are still underexplored, as scholarship has focused mainly in large organized efforts of rescue, such as the Kindertransport. However, there has been a push in integrating children's experiences within the greater Holocaust narrative. In her groundbreaking book, Deborah DeWork argues that children's narrative and experience should not be a marginal part of Holocaust history, as they have, and I quote, a central place, end quote, in its history. However, because of their age, children are portrayed mainly as agentless and, as the work herself describes, and I quote, helpless and dependent, end quote, which means that they're beholden to their parents' choices, implying that they don't have agency. This perspective has slowly changed within the field, with works such as Nicholas Stargard, who argue that children have agency because of their adaptability and how they're able to manipulate their bodies, for example, and saying that they do have agency, hence. So building on previous scholarship and based on the research that I conducted during my CIGR residency, I argue that an analysis of oral interviews of child Holocaust survivors who went to Latin America demonstrates that through language, interactions with the local population, and conceptions on race, children became active participants during the process of migration and in their family's acculturation, hence meaning children did have agency during this whole process. Okay, so each of the scholars who have researched the experiences of children and whose books are illustrated here a little bit in the back have developed their own definitions of children during the Holocaust. And if you look it up, everyone defines children a little bit different. However, in terms of my research, I define children during the Holocaust as those who experienced the Second World War and the Holocaust up to the age of 18 years old. This includes the children who would have surpassed this age by 1945, but escaped Nazi Germany by the time they were 18 years old. Yeah. Because of time, I cannot go in depth on how my definition of children differs from those of Deborah DeWork, Beth Cohen, and Rebecca Clifford. But if that's something that you're interested, I'm more than happy to talk it through at the end during the Q&A. So during my fellowship, I watched a total of 30 full interviews to assess the experiences of US child refugees in Latin America. This allowed me to gain an understanding about their lives before they left Nazi Germany, their journey, arrival, and life in their host countries. To focus my research, I selected interviews of children who were born in Germany and who went to either Argentina, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Uruguay. While Latin America received Jewish migrants from countries across Europe, my project primarily investigates the German Jewish population. This allows me to interrogate the unique experiences of this group, while also recognizing that Jews' experience of migration across Europe vary not only from where they're coming, but also different cultural backgrounds too, and religious differences. Meanwhile, my selection of countries of refuge allows me to investigate the experiences that children had in both countries of final places of refuge and transitory locations in which they waited for either the proper paperwork or for their immigration quota to be called up or to secure that passage to be able to leave. By studying multiple locations of refuge rather than just one, I connect the experiences of Jewish child refugees to demonstrate that these are not unique to a sole country. Through my inclusion of various countries in Latin America, I also trace trans-regional connections that a focus on a sole country might overlook. So by looking everything together, we can see that actually children are sharing all of these experiences. To analyze the 30 interviews that I watched during my fellowship, I utilized methodologies from memory studies and the history of emotions. These two fields allow me to analyze the recollections that adults have of their experiences as children. So this is a really important part of it. In my analysis, I take into consideration not only what they are saying, but also how they're saying it, the setting of the interview, the relationship that they have with the interviewer too, as all of this combined impact and shape how the survivor will narrate their story. So during the process of watching the interviews, there were 3 key themes that I could trace throughout them. And these were the importance of language, race, and the interactions that the children were having with the local populations. So while the 3 key themes that I trace are independently identifiable, at times they are presented together, as seen with this clip from Jose Mayer, who at the age of 8 years old went to Argentina with his parents and sister.
¿Y ustedes empezaron a estudiar?
Cuando yo fui al colegio, fui primero al profesor alemán, hasta el profesor sí, porque no sabía el idioma. Y ahí hice 2 años y medio, porque me retrasaron 1 año, con gran bronca mía, yo no entendía por qué, claro, porque no sabía el idioma. Entonces dice, yo tendría que haber pasado acá segundo, lo que sería ahora 3er grado, porque antes era primero inferior, primero superior, segundo, tercero. Lo que, yo tenía que haber ido al 3er grado, me pusieron en 2º grado, pero lo di prácticamente libre, a los 3 meses ya me pasaban a los otros colegios. Y después seguí en un colegio de Estado.
¿Y le costó aprender el idioma?
No, para nada, de chico me mostré el colegio. Lo aprendí en el colegio y creo que lo aprendí más en la calle todavía que en el colegio.
¿Y a sus padres?
A mis padres les costó, más a mamá que a papá. Claro, mamá estaba más en casa, papá salía a trabajar y todo, entonces lo escuchaba mucho más. Mamá estaba en casa y en ese tiempo, bueno, los conocidos y amigos, todo eso eran todos de la colectividad y hablaban todos alemán. Bueno, en ese tiempo vos ibas a estar por Belgrano, o cualquier calle de Belgrano, exagerando un poco, si hablabas en castellano te miraban como diciendo de dónde vino, ¿no? Porque todo el mundo estaba hablando en alemán. Y de inglés también se escuchaba bastante. Los guardas del tren, de la línea Mitre, había muchos guardas que sabían unas cuantas palabras de alemán, de tanto escucharlo en los trenes. Era increíble. Claro, toda la colectividad vino a parar acá. Como la colectividad, digamos, judío-polaca fue a parar a Villa Crespo, a esos lugares, la colectividad judío-alemana fue a parar a Belgrano.
As seen on this clip, José's description of Belgrano, a barrio Buenos Aires, highlights the tightness of the German Jewish migrant community from the various levels of acculturation that the community had. From the views that one would get if they spoke Spanish, to the Argentinian train guards learning a few German words to accommodate the community's lack of Spanish, we can see that the community wanted to preserve its identity rather than acculturate. The fact that German Jewish refugees primarily spoke both German and English while being in Belgrano emphasizes that many German Jewish refugees did not view Argentina as a location to stay long-term, even if later a lot of them remained there in the country. Their focus of learning English demonstrate their perception of viewing English as a more useful language, as many at that point aim to also continue their journey to the United States. From this clip, we can infer that Jose adapted quite easily into his surroundings. However, his parents found it more difficult to grasp the Spanish language, as they stayed mainly within the migrant Jewish community. Jose's emphasis on the tight German Jewish community in Belgrano highlights his adaptability as a young child in his host country and the impact that interactions with the local population had on child migrants. As a child, Jose was in a constant cultural exchange with the local Argentinian community beyond the confines of his school, as he describes truly learning the language in the streets of Buenos Aires, meaning that while the interviewer did not ask him about his friendships with local Argentinians, which, to be honest, I was a bit sad about, he must have relationships with them. In another clip from his interview later on, Jose speaks on his German cultural experiences with other migrant children as they all listened to Beethoven together and how great that experience was for them. His relationships with the local Argentinians and his grasp of Spanish while also still belonging to the German Jewish migrant community speaks to the in-between space in which Jewish child refugees were placed. And I also wanted to add something that from his interview, we can also see that there was a divide between the different groups of Jewish refugees that were coming, as they were all kind of stayed in their own areas of Buenos Aires too. So we're seeing how that also makes it more unique, their own experiences and how they're interacting with the local populations too. Yeah. This meant that children had to maneuver their social and cultural exchanges between the local population and their own migrant community, while at the same time shifting how they position themselves and how they're acting depending on who they're speaking to or in what areas they are. The importance and role of language in the experiences of Jewish child survivors in Latin America is also present through the name they choose to go by. While some survivors continue to use the names they had from before they went to their host countries, others adopted a Hispanicized versions of their names. Pictured here are parts of the pre-interview questionnaire of Jose Mayer, where we see how he listed his and his sister's name. As you can see, he only listed his Hispanicized version, while for his sister, he put the German Isel and then the name that she goes by in Argentina, Alexia. And then Mayer, the Bain, it's her new last name as she got married. While using a Hispanicized version of their original names in their host countries could have been a result of a myriad of variables, such as locals not being able to pronounce their German names, the fact that Jose adopted the Hispanicized version of his name gives us also a little bit of an insight into his adaptability and identity, as for example, in another clip of the interview, where he's talking about his parents, his dad's experience of going back to Germany and then coming back to Argentina and then speaking about it. Jose Mayer expresses, "Yo soy Argentina, I'm Argentinian." So we see here how even after spending all of that time, he's considering himself that. So he acquired that Argentinian identity. The use of Hispanicized names is not only limited to the Jewish children who stayed in Latin America. As an interviewer of the Shoah Foundation, I had the opportunity to interview a survivor who went to Ecuador when he was only 6 years old. While his older brother Bert only used a Hispanicized version of his name during the interview, during when he lived in Ecuador, apologies, the brother I interviewed used Carlos rather than Carl when he moved to the United States. The differences as to how the brothers interacted with their names demonstrates that the younger a child arrived in Latin America and the longer they stayed, the more connected they might feel to their country of refuge after they moved. As shown for Jewish child refugees, language was not only a tool they used to communicate with the local populations from their host countries, create relationships outside of their migrant communities, and aid their families, but for some, it also became part of their identity that they continue to have even as adults, and even sometimes when they left those Latin American countries where they had been during the war. While final locations of migration shaped US child refugees, children also adapted to transitory places of refuge. They stopped, as seen with this clip from Ingrid Altman, where she talks about school in Cuba and her Cuban friends.
Were you able to go to school in Cuba?
Yes,
What kind of
I
school?
went, my parents made a big sacrifice and they sent me to a private school. They felt I should get best education, and it was an American school and I should learn English. Actually, they taught me both English and Spanish. And in Spanish, I did my ingreso al Instituto de La Habana, which meant I could go to the even high school. And then I was continued in American high school. And that was
At this school.
at that school, it was an excellent school.
So is there any general thing you can say about those 4 years?
I enjoyed it.
You
I was a growing teenager. I had my social life, my school, and I started getting interested in boys, and
Were you mostly with other German people?
mostly, but I also had Cuban friends. And if I was dating a Cuban, I had to have a chaperone, or I would have been considered a trash. So my very bored mother tagged along. But it was more comfortable just to have German Jews as my friends.
And did your mother have
As a historian, this is one of those moments in which I wish the interviewer would have asked a follow-up question as to why she would be considered trash for dating a Cuban, and why was it easier to have German friends rather than Cuban. Unfortunately, this was not the case, as you can imagine. However, from the experiences that Ingrid shares and her demeanor, one can extrapolate information about her time as a child in Cuba while her and her family waited for the United States quota number to be called. Ingrid's account portrays a divide between the German Jewish refugee community and the local Cuban community that's presented in multiple levels. The first one is through education and language. Rather than going to the local Cuban school, Ingrid went to a private American school in Cuba, implying that it would provide her with a better education than the local school. While Ingrid's school taught both in Spanish and English, she focused more on her English instruction rather than her Spanish language skills, as she was preparing for when her and her family went to the United States. The emphasis on learning English rather than Spanish illustrates the transitory nature of Cuba as a place of refuge. While refugees did not know how long they were going to wait for in the island, many as Ingrid preferred to learn English rather than to improve their Spanish. In Cuba, Spanish was important as the majority of Jewish refugees waited for approximately 2 to 3 years for the United States quota number to be called. Even though Ingrid happily expresses that she enjoyed the 4 years that she was in Cuba, her experiences were limited by the perceptions that the German Jewish refugee community had of the local community. While Ingrid expressed that she had Cuban friends, she mentioned that her relationships with the local community had to be mediated through an adult. In Ingrid's case, her mother. Ingrid then nervously moves on her chair in the interview, as we saw, and says that if she were to date a Cuban, she would be considered, and I quote, trash. Ingrid does not specify who would consider her trash, but from her narrative, it can be inferred that she referred to the German Jewish refugee community. The comment demonstrates that German Jewish refugees who went to Latin America arrived in the region with their own racial and social hierarchies that they then attempted to maintain while in their host countries. As a child, while Ingrid was aware of this hierarchy, she still crossed the established boundary that her parents had set and had both friendly and romantic relationships with Cubans, as she hinted. Ingrid's account shows that compared to her parents, children were more willing to forge relationships with the local populations in their countries of refuge and challenge the established racial and social hierarchies even when they were aware of these. An experience that can be traced through multiple interviews of child Holocaust refugees who went to Latin America is the first time they saw a Black or Indigenous person, as seen on the following clip of then 7-year-old David Ackerman.
In Uruguay. It was a very exciting thing to get off the ship and see everybody shouting at each other, or at least I thought they were shouting. They were gesticulating and shouting, and that's the way they spoke the Spanish. And again, in German, we didn't do this. So I thought everybody was angry at everybody. I saw my first Black man over there. Only saw one and all the time I was there, but it was just soon after I got off the boat. This was a very black man, very neatly dressed in a suit. And since I was 7 years old and had never seen a Black man, I stared at him. And that must have made him uncomfortable because he got very angry. I don't know what happened. I think my parents pulled me away. It was a very strange and unaccustomed adventure.
As it was seen with David, many of the child Holocaust refugees who went to Latin America had their first interaction with a Black or Indigenous person in a port of their final country of refuge or transitory place of refuge within Latin America. David's experience shows that Jewish refugees arrive in Latin America with their own racial conceptions. For their children, this shaped the perception of what the rest of Latin America would be, even if, as David mentioned, they only saw one Black or Indigenous person in their host country. David's narration of this event follows an almost identical structure from that of other Jewish child refugees. In her interview, then 9-year-old Regina Weiss speaks about seeing a Black person for the first time in Puerto Rico, while her and her family were on their way to Sosua in the Dominican Republic. As Regina, David first emphasized the Blackness of the person he saw, and then rapidly shifted into describing their clothing, showing the impact that this interaction had on them. In her interview, Regina remembers the conversation that she had about the man that she saw in Puerto Rico with her mother, in which she asked that if her mother were to have another baby, if he would be Black. Meanwhile, David's detailed description of the man that he saw is juxtaposed with the second part of his story, which seems to escape him completely. David shrugs, looks down, and states, and I quote, "I don't know what happened. I think my parents pulled me away. It was a very strange and unaccustomed adventure," end quote. David's association with the second part of this story allows him to remove himself from the interaction that as a child, he might have considered uncomfortable as tensions rose high from what he described. Similar to David, the majority of the Jewish child refugees who at the time of migration were young boys describe reading the books of Carmine, apologies. While the same child survivors who stayed reading Carmine admitted they did not know anything about Latin America, they do mention they imagine Latin America and its inhabitants the same way that the books described it, and as the book stated, that the journey there was going to be an adventure. Both of David's and Regina's accounts of seeing a Black person for the first time highlight how even though they were young as migrants, they brought their own racial conceptions that, as I mentioned before, shaped how they view their host countries and interacted with them. The new role that Jewish child refugees acquired in their host countries is highlighted through the responsibilities their communities and parents gave them during the process of migration. These responsibilities could encompass the children working, explaining aspects of their host countries to their parents, translating, or in some cases, being intermediaries to secure the successful migration of family members to Latin America. This was the case for Eva Eisman right here, who at 13 years old had to speak with Sara Terra, the wife of the president of Uruguay, Alfredo Valdomir, to secure the entrance of her maternal grandmother to Uruguay. And now she's going to recount that experience.
But first we had to get my grandmother out here. That was the big thing, because my mother really went berserk and she went nuts, and my grandmother was there. And we didn't have any money at all then. So then I remember distinctly that she said to me, now Omi has to come. We have to do it. And she took me, by this time I'm 13, and 6 months spoke the language. Language is my forte. I got that fast. Not my mother, but because we were little, we got it fast. And we went on the streetcar. My mother went to the market and they bought a big bouquet of flowers. And we got directions to get to the palace. Palace sounds fancy. It was a small palace. Uruguay was a small country. My mother said, you have to go inside this palace. You have to see that you get to speak to the wife of the president of Uruguay. And there were the 2 soldiers there. And she said, no, it's impossible, but you have to make it possible. So I marched with my pretty little dress and the flowers in my arms to the door of the palace and negotiated, talked to the soldiers, cried. I don't know what I did. He did let me in. I did get to see the wife of the president of Uruguay. I did tell her my story. She did make one phone call, and on that one phone call, we built it and built it and built it, and ultimately were able to get my grandmother out. We got her papers. We had to send some money for her to get out, and about 9 or 10 months later, after us, she came. And once she.
So before I continue, I wanted to point out one of the main reasons why for her mother it was so important to bring the grandmother was because at this time both the parental grandparents and the maternal grandfather had died. So both of the parental grandparents, she describes that they died of a broken heart when the family moved to Latin America. And then the maternal grandfather, she says that the same thing happened. So when the maternal grandfather passed, she, in another part of the interview, a little bit before of the clip that I played, she describes that her mother's complete demeanor changed and that it was okay, we have to make it possible for your grandmother to be here. So this is why it kind of set up the plan of her of going. As Eva recounted, she did not know what the plan was until they got to the Suarez residency, the small palace that she mentions that the president lived in. Eva's mother could have asked Eva to accompany her and be the translator with first the guard and then Terra, but she did not make this decision. Rather, Eva went alone, nicely dressed, with flowers for Terra. This event highlights 2 important aspects about the experiences of Jewish child refugees in Latin America. The first one is the advantages of their positionality as children, as their adaptability and perceived innocence allows them access to governmental and local institutions that help Jewish refugees establish themselves in Latin America or look for further opportunities elsewhere. The perception of the guard and of Terra's, of Eva as an innocent child that had first faced persecution and that now sought for her family to be reunited, facilitated her entrance into the residency and also Terra's phone call that then became the base for then bringing on the grandmother. And at this time, I want to clarify, it was really difficult for someone older to go to Latin America, as many Latin American countries wanted to bring people to participate in agricultural projects. However, a lot of them tried to participate, but then they didn't have those skills, so then they ended up doing other things. The second aspect is the role of children as active agents of migration. While Eva's mother is the one who took her to the Suarez residency to intervene for Eva's grandmother, it was Eva herself who had to convince the guard to first let her into the residency and then speak to Terra, the president's wife, as only a 13-year-old. Can you imagine that as a 13-year-old doing that? Yeah. Thus, without Eva's intervention, it is possible that the grandmother would have never made her way to Uruguay. While not every Jewish child refugee had to speak to the president of a country or their partner, Eva's account of speaking to Terra demonstrates the important role that children had in their host countries. Other children had to speak with migration officers to help their families secure passage or work to support their families too. As children, they had to use their perceived innocence to their advantage in order to aid their family. While they were still seen as children by their family, their role within the family itself changed drastically as children implicitly and explicitly gain an active role within their families. Through the oral interviews I shared with you today, I aim to center Jewish child refugees' voices within the prominent migration narrative of the Holocaust. My research proves that children were active migrants. This is different from previous scholarship that assumed that children were passive historical figures who did not have an active role during the Holocaust. We see the agency and active role of children as interlocutors of language, culture, and local racial conceptions. As interlocutors, they became a key part of the acculturation of their families. The use of oral testimonies to study the experiences of Jewish child refugees who went to Latin America give an insight of both the experiences of children at the time of migration and of the reflection of such children as adults. A study of not only the experiences of Jewish child refugees, but also multiple Latin American countries demonstrates that the experiences of children in the region were not unique to a sole country, as I previously mentioned. It also highlights that in order to fully understand the experiences of Jewish Holocaust refugees, we need to create connections between Latin American countries and look beyond locations that were considered final places of refuge. As I've shown in this lecture, in the transitory locations of refuge, the children stop. They employ their new role of interlocutors and use it to create connections between their community and locals. In order to construct an inclusive narrative of migration during the Holocaust, it is necessary to include the Global South and to center other perspectives beyond those of the adults. As I hope I demonstrated here today, children are an essential and important part of this story. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alexia. So now we'll have time for questions. And I know I've already seen some come in on Zoom, but we'll start here in the room. And do you mind calling on people yourself?
Oh yeah, sure. Paisa.
Okay, so in the interviews, did you notice a difference between the roles of boys and girls in their host countries?
Yes. So contrary to the boys, so within the boys and the girls, we see that boys, while girls often talk about going to school when they go to Latin America, boys are the ones who a lot of the times they mention, especially the older brothers, right? They're the ones who mention, yeah, I have to support my family. I am not going to go to school because my parents want me to study something that's useful that can help me. So a lot of them actually end up working in trade. So that's one of the differences. And also, funny enough, the girls are also the ones who talk more about their relationships with the local community too, rather than the boys. The boys sometimes give a hint here and there. And when they talk about those relationships, it's a lot of times, oh yeah, you know, I kind of dated a local Argentinian or Uruguayan, right? But it was never serious because it was expected for me to marry someone within the community. So even like seeing those aspects of it. However, we do see that at times, for example, when the boys then grow up, they married locals, and that's a shock also for the family. So those are a little bit of the differences between the boys and the girls. So,
well, first of all, thank you so much for this really compelling talk. And I just love to see all the material you found come together here, and the way you're putting it together so kind of persuasively. Okay, so my question is, you expressed a little frustration with some of the interviewers, which I certainly understand, and there seems to be a pattern of them stopping just when things get interesting. And I'm wondering if as you know from memory studies, people remember things in kind of formulas, right? And they tend to, you hear, for example, I was on the last train, you know, in testimony after testimony, and everyone couldn't have been on the last train. And so I'm wondering if some of these accounts are the kinds of formulas that people remember, and how the testimonies and kind of later stories compare with the ego documents from the time that you've looked at, like diaries and letters. And then I just wanted to quickly ask about the, Jose Maria talked about the collective a couple of times. Is he referring to a specific organization, or is that just the word he's using for the group?
Yeah.
Right.
So I'll start with that one. The collective is just the German Jewish migrant refugee group that's in Belgrano. Yeah. With the other questions, yes, especially looking at the interviews that focus in Latin America, it's something that has been at times really frustrating, because as you all saw, that the interview would kind of then continue. And I do think it's formulated, I think it's formulated and how they perceive themselves, their time in Latin America, right? Especially a lot of this children either they stayed in their host countries and then continue mainly to the United States. So a lot of them just want to get, especially for those who want to get to the United States, are like, okay, let me just get to that point of when I was finally here and established. So I think it's a combination of those aspects of how they're seeing their narrative of just seeing Latin America as a place that they were there for a little bit and then continued. But also I think it's a reflection of what people consider narratives of Latin America in that moment when the interviews were taken. I think it's at that time. Now we're seeing thanks to amazing scholars who are also here in the room too. We're seeing that the focus has increased in Latin America, and that kind of shift. And even when I did my interviews, I made sure to make sure to focus on those transitory places and those places in Latin America, because that's also my own personal interest. So we see also the heavy role that the interviewer has there. And compared to the other ego documents, it's quite interesting because for, I'm thinking of two memoirs that I've read. There's one of a 17-year-old who stopped in Puerto Rico, and in how he describes his experience in Puerto Rico and in the memoir is quite, it's a little bit different. In the memoir, he provides more information than what he provides here in the interview. However, and here Puerto Rico is just a place of passing. However, with other memoirs, what I've seen is that the focus becomes Latin America. And that's when they're actually expressing their time there. I recently, last week, I was reading a memoir in which he wrote it when he was 94 years old. But he talks about how he had girlfriends who were from Ecuador, but he never crossed the line. So you see how the differences how they're expressing themselves too. I think that it's also just once during the interview, once they are saying it, it's okay, I have to continue. But also with memoirs, they do have the time to sit down and be, okay, can I actually publish this or not. And he made the decision to publish that. So.
94.
Yeah, 94. Oh, yes.
You know, I've often wondered why it was that so many Jews went to Argentina, given that, as I understand it, Argentina was probably, although neutral, was the most Nazi-leaning country of those countries. So why didn't they go to the other countries rather than to Argentina?
So one of the main reasons why many went to Argentina is because Argentina had a long established Jewish community there. So a lot of them already had some connections that were in Argentina. Also, Argentina was one of the countries that closed their immigration doors a little bit later too, but it's not the last one. So there's other countries that were still open, that it was easier for them. Once Argentina is, okay, we're not going to allow any more Jews, this doesn't mean that Jews stopped trying to go to Argentina. A lot of them, as we saw with one of the testimonies, they came from Paraguay, but Uruguay was the main place that they would be going from to there. So that was one of the main reasons, just the long established community that was there.
Oh, that's interesting.
Thank you so much, Alexia. In the beginning, you talked about different speeds of adaptability, and you made this distinction between parents and children. So when you listen to these testimonies, can you complicate this a little bit more than to just have this black and white? Parents are slow, children are fast. What is, for example, gender, age? How does this influence? Are there children who don't adapt quickly? So I would like ask you to elaborate a little bit more. And then you made at the end of the talk a comment where you said children are the key part of the acculturation of the family. And I wonder, sometimes, is this really true for the whole family? Do they really kind of adapt, or is it just the children who adapt and the parents are not? So maybe you can talk a little bit.
Yeah. So the first part of differences, yeah, no, it's not as black and white as I presented it. Of course, we do see, and even, for example, with Jose Major, right? He talks about how his father was learned Spanish much faster than his mother too, right? So we're seeing that those kind of gender dynamics too are heavily impacting the relationships and how so that they are interacting with the local community too. So that's a definitely important aspect of it. And that's one of the reasons why I also, when I was selecting the interviews that I was watching, so I did 30, I wanted to do 15 men, 15 women, to make sure to be able to compare those gender dynamics too and those experiences too. And the key part of the acculturation of the family, especially the older children within it, you see that they're not being kind of that connector between the local community too, but also within the own family in itself. One of my favorite things that was during this internship was looking at different siblings talking about the same experiences, because it's dramatically different how each of them portrayed what happened or how they consider their parents. And so all of those dynamics, as someone who also has siblings, hi to them who are connected, those are really important. So, and what comes to mind is there's two siblings who I saw, they went to Argentina, but what happened with them was that before they went to Argentina, they actually did the kinder transport. So they were in England, and then while they were in England, their family was able to go to Argentina, and the parents were able to then secure all the documentation to bring them in, and they came. What happened was that the younger sibling had forgotten all of his German, but was learning Spanish really quickly. Meanwhile, the older sibling still retained his German, and he's really specific of, yeah, I could speak English, but I never lost my German accent. My younger sibling completely lost his German accent with English. So we're seeing also those differences between not only age for siblings, and within the family, he actually had to become the interpreter between the younger brother and the parents themselves, because the younger brother almost completely lost his German. So we're seeing that the children did in fact have that important role with it. So yeah, so I think they have a key part of it. And of course, at times we see that the parents had their own socialization with the locals and everything, but in a lot of times it was those children who brought in that cultural aspect. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll insert a few questions
Yes,
from Zoom.
of
So
course.
you might want to jot them down. We have a lot of questions on Zoom, and I apologize in advance that we're not going to be able to get to all of them. One viewer asks whether you encountered any examples of children or adolescents who fled without their parents to Latin America, and if so, how their experiences differ. The adventure for children moving with parents might be fear and trauma for those traveling alone, and also maybe a child without a family would have allowed them to adapt more quickly if there wasn't German in their household, and lots of other good examples. So that's one question. Another question is, are there any connections between the racialization of Black and Indigenous people in Latin America with the racialization of Black Germans and the Sinti Roma population? And the final question is, sorry, in the talk, you said the comments demonstrate that German Jewish refugees who went to Latin America arrived in the region with their own racial and social hierarchies. It sounds like racism in some of the examples you cited, but do you consider it something different? And is it an important choice not to use the term racism in this case?
Okay. Starting with the examples of children who went to Latin America without their parents. Yes, that was actually one of my first findings when I started working on this project, and it was during my first summer as a PhD student that I went to Germany and I encountered this. So from Berlin, approximately 40 children escaped Berlin through the Rittner group. And for me, that was really interesting because I had never heard about the Rittner group. And with them, it was a couple of, I think it was in total 3 trips. And it was a young couple, the wife was pregnant, and they decided to go there. Actually, the Kurt Rittner's wife, her testimony is in the Shoah Foundation. And side note, it was the way that they describe how they chose Argentina, it's quite different. Kurt describes that, yeah, we just selected Argentina because it was a large country, right? Large country. Meanwhile, she's the one who actually was, okay, no, we selected Argentina, we had to think about it. Kurt asked me what country I preferred, and I said Argentina. So here we see that differences of the narratives. But yeah, so through the Rittner group, the children actually all lived together, and while they were there, they learned Spanish, they all had jobs too. The house where they all lived together only lasted for 2 years, but the impact that they had within the Argentinian Jewish community was extremely big, because when they arrived there, they were, okay, there's a couple of differences between the established Jewish community here and us who are common. So they actually began La Nueva Comunidad Israelita in Buenos Aires. So we see there the impact of those Jewish migrants who are arriving. The second question was it about the connections and racializations of Black and Indigenous and Sinti and Roma?
Yeah, the racialization of Black Germans in the Sinti and Roma population.
Unfortunately, my focus is not on this question, so I don't think I can answer it that well. But we can definitely see that there's connections there, right? Both groups were apologies. Both groups were well, especially for the Sinti and Roma, right? They were targeted. They were also apologies. They were also placed in camps too, and we also see with the treatment of Black Germans too that they were also targeted that way too. So I apologize for not being able to answer that question that well. And the third question was
about racism.
Yes. So that's something that when I was watching all of these interviews, especially as someone from Puerto Rico too, it's, you hear things that shock you, right? But at the same time, the way that I think about it, it's, they're coming with their own, as I said, they're coming with their own racial conceptions too. And for a lot of them, it was impactful, right? For a lot of them, they had only heard stories about, how people looked and how Latin America was. Or for some of them, they didn't even know what, as I said during the talk, that they didn't know what Latin America even was or who was there too. So I don't think I would say it's racism, although it's, kind of that aspect of it. But what I would say is just, you definitely see how they stand by their own European identity to claim their own superiority at times too. Because even there's narratives that I found that they position themselves, so there's the category of mestizos who in Latin America, and or like criollo too, and they position themselves in that aspect because they're also trying to cling to that whiteness to be incorporated into the nation too. So I think it's also just trying to, when I'm looking at this interviews too, it's not putting today's mind frame, well, I am analyzing it too, and just thinking, okay, how was it that they grew up with it? How was it that they learned about it too? But yeah, a lot of times it's really difficult when in multiple testimonies, they describe Latin America as primitive, as, people didn't wash, all of this like misconceptions, right, too. So it's just trying to detangle it a little bit more and seeing, okay, how is it that their own racial conceptions are being influenced by the ones that are in their own host countries, which the host countries are trying to incorporate them. And in other places such as Puerto Rico, it's not only the racial conceptions that the migrants themselves bring, but also Puerto Rico, colony of the United States during that time too, they had both the racial conceptions of Puerto Ricans who saw Jewish people as they're white, they're coming from Europe, everyone who's coming, but the American colonial government was no, we don't see them completely as white. So it's all of this coming together. It's one of the reasons why within my, sorry for the long answer, within my research, one of the reasons why it is difficult to define race, because I am looking at multiple countries and each country defines race differently too. So long answer, I apologize.
I noticed that clothing and the way that people described clothing came up in, I think, almost every testimony that you showed in the presentation. And in the first testimony, the formal clothing of the parents was something that it seemed like the woman was judging a bit. Yeah. And then when the man was speaking about seeing a Black person for the first time, he mentioned the color of his skin and then immediately mentioned that he was well dressed. So what does clothing communicate, or what did it communicate to them as children? And is that a common thread? Pun intended, I guess.
Yeah, really good, really good question. And yes, here a lot of the times we're seeing that clothing was a way for them to still anchor and connect themselves with that life that they had left behind. So clothing is extremely important here. And as we see with Eva's photograph that you referred to, Eva is dressed, and there's other photos that she describes too. And Eva is dressed as a typical Argentinian child, right? But what struck me about that was her referring to her parents the way that she did, and then seeing those different levels of, her parents are really holding in, which is something, I think that a lot of, migrant groups also do, right? No, just because you love your country doesn't mean that you're gonna change the way that you dress, the way that you speak, the way that all of those things, right? So clothing really important. And regarding your second point too, with the example that I gave of Regina, she actually describes that the Black person that she saw was only wearing shorts. And for her, that struck her, because how was it that someone was only wearing shorts too, right? So we're seeing that the children and their parents are making those connections with their own clothing just for the cultural aspect too, and retaining that connection too, but also it's a symbol of class and a symbol of the standing in how they are doing, right? So I think it's really important, something that you really continue. Charlotte.
Thank you so much for such an incredible presentation.
Of course.
I was just kind of wondering, because you talk a lot about like your main points here about language and race and interaction with the local population. So we're talking about a lot of things that are happening out in, one could say, out in public. So I was wondering how like the private lives or the private spheres are being impacted in these migratory landscapes. And I mean, obviously you can argue that the private and public spheres aren't as separate as people like to think they are, but like, yeah. I don't know. I just don't know if you like the private lives are also being spoken about in new ways or in the same ways, and what sort of conclusions you can draw from that as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. Yes, really good question too. So definitely we can see a little bit of a divide, but at times it kind of like comes together. But yeah, the private sphere, we're seeing that for example, the maintaining the German language too, really important too. But then we also see how the families themselves kind of change a little bit, even going back to the clothing, like some of them start dressing differently too, for example, and just also the interactions that they're having. So something that was really important too in that kind of merging of public and private sphere too, that we see with the Jews that are coming and the Jews are already there, is that there was the emphasis of we have to make sure that once they're coming to Latin America, a prominently Catholic region, that they do not convert, right? That they continue with their religious, with Judaism, right? So we're seeing that they try to really emphasize within the private spheres, like, no, you have to, continue with the rites, you have to continue passing this time, you have to come to the activity. So it's like kind of making sure that the community continues to be tight. But then within the private sphere, we see that, for example, as I also showed, parents are not allowing their children to also interact with the local community too. So yeah, the private sphere is really important too, as they want to just preserve that identity. Thank you. Scott, I saw that you had your hand from it.
I echo Charlotte's comments about thank you for a really engaging talk. It's been really exciting to see this work kind of come together and take shape, and the exciting things that you've really got out of these interviews. You make a big kind of distinction throughout about the difference between kind of refugees who come to a single place and establish themselves, and those who are more transitory, who come to one place and then move on to a separate place, and focus particularly on the role that children play in kind of this acculturation. I'm really curious about those families who moved multiple times and whether that acculturation process was different between the transitory places and their kind of final places. Do children play the same roles? Do they have a harder time adjusting on the second and third stops when they move? Especially if they're moving within countries within this wider Latin American region.
Thank you so much for your question. Yeah, so first of all, with the going to different places rather to only one, so that's actually connected to why I use migration rather than immigration. So I think the term, of course, immigration, we all know what it means, going from one place to another, right? But using that term also makes it seem as if they, for example, left Nazi Germany and went directly to Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, right? So that's one of the reasons why I use migration, just because it doesn't imply that you went directly to one place, but you stop in multiples. So even in those final host countries, many describe stopping in the Dominican Republic, Paraguay, Puerto Rico. So we're seeing that that even to go to that final place, they have to stop. And if the children play the same roles, yes, the children play the same roles, even as if they're waiting for a couple of days, 2 years in one place. The memoir that I had, that I had mentioned before, that it's also and there's an interview, and it's based on Puerto Rico. He was only in Puerto Rico for a short period of time. One afternoon he was in Puerto Rico, basically one literal afternoon he was there, right? And during that time, he was taking his younger siblings to go to the bathroom because his parents were trying to figure out passage to New York. And what happens is that as he's going there, and again, this is Puerto Rico, right? So we have a strong American presence, especially also at this time. He encounters a ship captain, tells the story, and the ship captain literally, come with me, spoke with someone else, got two cigars, gave them to someone else. It was like, okay, yeah, your family now has passage. And they left to New York. So we see that without him in that position of that mediator of migration, who knows how long they would have stayed in Puerto Rico trying to get that passage, right? Especially because they wanted to get to New York by Passover too. So that was a really important aspect of it. So that's one of the reasons why I am also so interested in those transitory places, because first of all, a lot of times they just get ignored. Even in the interviews, they're like, oh yeah, and we stopped here, here, here. But the important thing is when I got to the US, right? And I think we lose a lot about the experience, and not only the adaptability and all of those aspects, but we do lose a lot of how the children behave and the impact that even being there for an afternoon can have on the role that the children play. So, okay, question.
So my grandfather was one who went from Germany to Argentina.
Oh.
And he left because, and came to Chicago, was because of so many Nazi refugees who were moving in. And did you find any of that in reading all of your memoirs of families that were affected by the Nazis who were fleeing Germany when the war was over? Because Argentina was such a huge, they just basically kept their doors open, according to my grandfather, because his town was overridden by Nazis, and the Jews who had been there for 10 years so far, got up and left. And many did not stay in South America. They came to America, which they had actually put down roots and were planning to stay until the Nazis moved in. And so and as my grandfather put it, the children were the connection. They were the translators. The mothers never left the kitchens, never left the homes. They didn't interact with anyone, not even in the market. The children were given money to go buy the food. The husbands worked, but they worked with other Germans. They weren't necessarily working with Argentinians. And so for my grandfather, he was the only one who spoke Spanish. Wow. And so, and even getting to America, it took years for my great-grandparents to learn English. And when my great-grandmother passed away right after I was born, my parents said that she barely spoke English at all. And I'm just like, well, she's been here for 30 years. So I think the children were the key, according to my grandparents, but also, did you see in the memoirs that you read the influence of the Nazis coming to South America? Because that was just huge for my grandparents. Well, especially my grandmother wasn't in South America. She came through New York, but my grandfather did, and he left because of that.
Yeah, thank you first for sharing your family story with us today. And yes, so especially with Argentina, we see that with the rise of Peronismo, a lot of those US child refugees who did go to Argentina mentioned that there was a rise of a little, and they say it wasn't really anti-Semitic, but they could see that some aspects have shifted. And yes, there were a lot of those kind of passing through and those connections with the already German community that was there in Argentina, but also all of those people that were coming. And actually, as you were talking, I remember, so during my residency in Munich, I found a book from the German community. This is from Mexico, but they had a book that it was from 1936, if I remember correctly. And the book had, you know, the swastika, and it talked about how was it that they were seeing a lot of German Jews coming to to Mexico, and how was it that they were going to maintain that divide and maintain the true Germanness of their own culture while in Mexico, right? So we do really see those connections and passing through, right? And the kids themselves, from the interviews that I saw, a couple of them do mention, yeah, you know, there were a lot of people who spoke German, and a lot of the children that I personally viewed escaped kind of during 1938, 1939, right? So a lot of them also, you know, describe persona too. And they do mention, you know, okay, so what's gonna happen when a lot of people start coming here too? So that's something that's also in their own minds. But I am remembering an experience that I actually had with an interviewer, in which, with an interviewee that I did, that he spoke about it. He mentioned this was my second Holocaust, and it was him, he was dating a young German girl who had gone to Brazil, and they had become friends, and they dated, then they broke up, then they reunited. And he mentions, yeah, we were practically engaged. She knew I was Jewish, and that's a really important part here too. She knew that I was Jewish, and all of a sudden she broke up with me. And she didn't seem as if she wanted to really break up. And then a couple of months later, I saw her father's picture in the newspaper, and her father was the commander of Srebrenica. And he mentions, you know, I shared a table with this man. He knew that I was Jewish, and he didn't say anything to me, right? So from not only the interviews I've seen, but the interviews that I've conducted, that's one of the most, that's the most explicit example that I've encountered. So, yeah.
Were there any examples of like cross-cultural instances between like religion, especially since they went to primarily like Catholic countries?
Yeah. So so especially, for example, in Argentina during Peronismo too, we see that it's okay, you have to teach Catholicism too in the schools, right? The schools were really religious too. So the children were interacting with the Catholic religion. However, what a lot of the children describe is that during the moment of migration and the moment that they settle within their host countries, some of their parents who before were not religious, they started practicing more, right? So we're seeing that moment of having to leave your country, right, because of persecution, actually in some cases it heightened their Jewishness too, right? Their connection with Judaism too. But yeah, there's, especially with when the children grow up and they married people who are locals, who are Catholics, that's a really big aspect for it too, especially just also because at the end of the war, there's this term that's called in the best interest of the child, right? That it's, you know, and specifically it's connected to the children who were placed within Catholic families, and everyone's trying to kind of bring them back, right? To connect it with their own families too. So it's just, we see the emphasis of here children having of, and the moment that they get to their host countries is, okay, no, we need to make sure that we continue. So there's those moments, but I didn't, at least in the interviews that I saw, the children either became more Jewish, like they started practicing more, or they said, I lost my connection with Judaism, I stopped practicing. So we get like those kind of divides.
Okay, we need to wrap up, so please join me. Thank you again to Beth and Arthur Lev, who funded the fellowship that Alexia has. And our next lecture is Same time next week, Wednesday at noon, and it's about the surveillance of German intellectuals in Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and the US by our Center Fulbright visiting scholar Heisa Lonso. Hope that you join us in person and online. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha.